Okay, so we are live. Welcome to everybody and friends from all over. My name is Sanjan, and I'm very honored to have my friend and guest and teacher and many different very important person in my life spiritually, Asha Nayaswami. She's in Ananda Palo Alto in California, and I'm in Ananda Sacramento. So today we're going to discuss the incredible book which has touched my heart very deeply, which I consider to be a spiritual Bible and really a guide, a map. So the path, which is the original version, and then the new path that was updated. So we'll discuss that because Asha was there with Swami Kriyananda, who wrote the book, and she helped him type it up and was all around that time, and his secretary and a dear, dear, deep friend. So I thought it was a great way to just to draw on her wisdom, her attunement, her very unique experience of being with Swami Kriyananda and serving in helping him create books and be part of his life, and that we can really draw on that because I'm about to start a class series tomorrow morning here on the Ananda Sacramento YouTube channel, where we will take the new path and we will study it and meditate on aspects of it. So thank you for joining me, Asha, and maybe we'll start with a prayer and then I'll let you introduce yourself. So let's begin just closing the eyes, feeling the presence of the masters, especially Yogananda and his direct disciple Swami Kriyananda. And let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of self-realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, and beloved Paramahansa Yogananda, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, we bow at your feet. Guide this satsang, help us to dive deep into the rich ocean of the spiritual waters of this beautiful book. Help us to be in tune and grow through this experience. Om, peace. Amen. Okay, so Asha, I'm gonna first of all hand it over to you. I think most people will know you, but just I don't know if there's any introduction and just what you'd like to begin to say, and then I can jump in with some questions and we just see how the flow goes.
Okay. I was 22 years old in 1969, and as it happened, I was living about a mile from where I'm presently living, which is in Palo Alto. I seem to have a geographical relationship with just two places, which is Palo Alto and Ananda Village. And but it was 69. It was sort of the whole world was really beginning to shift, and there were a lot of Eastern influences and teachers around. I myself for about 4 years had been very deeply engrossed in studying metaphysical teachings, but I did not really have a path. I didn't really have a way of life. I was completely entranced with the philosophy, but my life was not changing, and that was very distressing to me. And a friend met Swami Kriyananda. He was one of the teachers on the scene, so to speak, in San Francisco. He lived there. And she said to me, I've met a real teacher and I think you'll like him. That's what she said to me. And he was speaking at Stanford University, not sponsored by the university, but by a fraternity. He put up a tent and then had this program. And I went with some friends and he walked into the room. He didn't speak. I didn't hear a word he said. And as soon as he walked in, I felt that he had an limited state of consciousness, and
Wow.
that consciousness was exactly what I was trying to achieve. And the phrase that just came out of nowhere said, "He has what I want," like that. And I'd never thought that before. I'd seen a few teachers, not a lot, a few teachers, a few swamis. I'd never had any response to any of them, but I recognized him. That's the only words.
It's
And
so interesting. It's so interesting because I was just saying, it's seeing Master, yoga, sorry, Swami, Swami as young Donald Walters.
uh-huh,
I just kind of was in New York and discovered Autobiography of a Yogi, and just immediately, not immediately, once he opened the book and started reading, he immediately felt that connection with Yogananda and that vibration. So,
yeah. Once you take into account past lives, it's not at all surprising. Once you realize that, especially the spiritual relationship, transcends time and space, then it's really just a question of having gotten your body organized enough so that you're finally ready to get on with your life. That's exactly how I felt when I met Swami. It's like, I mean, I was relatively young, but I was pretty intense and I was pretty concerned about what wasn't happening in my life. So
right.
when I saw him, and then I heard he had a community, which meant it was a way of life. And for me, this was also very important. He had a retreat, which meant we weren't dropping out. We were building something, and inherent in building it was to share it. And then
Wow.
he spoke. I'd made all these decisions. I mean, I made the decision about who he was going to be to me. I made that in about 15 seconds. If
Wow.
I hadn't been so loyal to it for the last 50 years, you would question. But
Hmm.
as it turned out, it was true. I
Incredible.
didn't I didn't know that 50 years later it would still be in place. I just hoped it would be.
Mm.
And
Yes.
as it's turned out, it has been. And then he spoke, and I remember nothing of what he said, except that I did learn those facts somehow. But I remember thinking he was so intelligent. And for me, it's like intelligence is like it's like my hobby. and
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
the fact that he was so articulate and so
Yeah.
that way, it was
Well,
like, well,
that's
this.
what I think here at Ananda, that's what one of the things that really people love about you is that just the ability to kind of very practically, but also very intelligently and wisely explain the teachings and explore them so honestly and fearlessly. And that was one of the other reasons why this conversation was something that I'm just thoroughly looking forward to, because of that ability. So,
Whatever I have, it's all the grace of God and Swami's training. Believe
mhm.
me, you should have seen me before he got a hold of me, is all I can say.
Well, I always love hearing how people, when they come to the path, especially the founding members, were kind of like, so green, fresh, and didn't know what was going on, and a mess in a way. It kind of makes it helps us newer on the path to feel that there's hope at the end of the tunnel, at the end of the path. So,
Well, I'm always a little betwixt and between because
mm,
everybody has a right to their privacy, and you don't want to be telling everybody's tales if they don't want to tell them. But
mm,
at the same time, there's a lot of history, and a
yeah,
lot of what shines today was polished in some very hard won,
yeah,
and you can trust it. You can
yeah,
trust what you see in people who've been on our path for a long time because it's not superficial. It's
yes,
hard won. I
exactly.
mean, it's not by no means do I mean everybody struggled and suffered, but we had our moments. We had our days and our years
Yeah.
when lots happened that we had to learn from. That's the path. Thank God. I mean, if you didn't change, what a useless project it would be.
Yeah, and that's what I really love about the book is I mean, for me, when I came to this path, it was rereading Autobiography of a Yogi, and I didn't really know. Swami Kriyananda, and people mentioned reading The New Path. And I kind of didn't connect with him immediately because, I was used to Yogananda in this orange robe, long hair, Indian. And here I was learning energization exercises and he's dressed in a cravat. I didn't know whether he was English or American. He looks like he's about to go for tea with the Queen. It's just like, is this guy, a yoga, this is the person I'm meant to tune into. But the new path, the new path really helped me, amongst other things, seeing him and connecting in different ways. But most especially, the new path really got me to feel who he was, and also to tune in more and more over the years how quickly and deeply he really tuned into Master and knew who he was in a very deep way. It's kind of like a little sense like Gyanamata in the 20s was able to immediately tune into who the guru disciple relationship and who Yogananda was, and here was Swami coming in and just got it. So
I have an interesting comment from Swami on that very point.
mm,
There was a time, the, the first edition of that book, Swami revised it about 25 years later, but um, that's why it's the path and the new path. But when he wrote the path, I was working as his secretary, and it was the last book he wrote before he got a computer. And Swami edited and re-edited, and he needed to have an absolutely clean page with
mm,
not a single editorial pencil mark on it before he could be sure a page was done. So as a consequence, I typed that book a lot. I mean, pages of it over and over again, and the whole thing multiple times because he's a very conscientious editor. But at one point, he was in Hawaii. Somebody had given him an apartment on the Kona coast to use over the summer of 1976. And I and a woman named Kalyani, who also worked for Swami in a secretarial way, and Swamiji and I spent about a month or 3 weeks, I don't remember. And we were retyping he was final editing on part one of the book, which includes meeting Master, reading autobiography, and going to meet Master. It's a long introduction to this.
mhm,
When I was retyping that really final form, I said, "Sir, because by that point I also worked at our retreat. And so I was in touch with a lot of people, and I was always meeting people who were just starting on the path and working with them and helping them. I said, Sir, in certain ways, the fact that you recognized Master immediately and became his disciple in a matter of days, I said, it's going to be confusing for people because most people wake up to their spiritual relationships more slowly,
mhm,
and there's more doubt, and there's more need for experience, and there's confirmation. I said, the fact that you did it instantly is going to make people feel that if they don't have an instant recognition, then it might not be their path.
mm,
And Swami answered me extremely seriously. He said, I know. He said, I've thought about that a lot. I know that my experience was not at all typical. He said, and then he sort of shrugged. He said, but that's the way it happened. So that's the
mm.
only way I can tell the story.
And it's so true because serving in kind of supporting people through their path and coming to Ananda, you do see that people. I mean, myself took time. I mean, I read autobiography in my early 20s. It was the early 30s when I reread it, and it still took a few years to connect even more deeply.
Mhm,
But I know people really do that. They're wondering, is Master
mhm,
my guru? Is this my path?
mhm.
Amazing.
It's
So
just amazing. But it's the how that happened for him, and yet it's how it happened for me also. Master took a little longer, but Swami was instantaneous.
yeah,
So
and and so when did he actually start writing the book? Do you know?
let's see, I have it in my book Light Bear. I believe he started trying it in 1971 or 72, and then he couldn't make it work, and so he stopped.
Mm,
My belief is he started in 74. In my biography of Swamiji, Light Bearer, I actually have it. If before I wrote that book, before I published that book, I had all those facts exactly in my
Mm.
mind. Once it was published, it's sort of like,
You let them go.
but my
Yeah.
belief is he started writing in 71 and then stopped because it wasn't the right time, then
Mhm.
picked it up again in 74. And when he
Mhm.
picked it up in 74, he went straight through.
That
And
you're
in
right.
76, the summer of 76, he'd finished I think he'd finished the whole book. He polished part one. He finished the whole
Mhm.
book. We published it in 1977, if I'm not mistaken. He
Yeah,
finished
because
it. Yeah, he
we'll
finished
look
it
a
before.
little. Sorry, you carry on.
He finished it before the end of 76, but he wasn't really ready until the spring of 77.
Yeah, I'll actually read in a little bit from your book, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him.
Uh-huh.
There's a beautiful story, Meditate on Greatness, and in it he says it took me 3 years to really to really write it, and he did, and it should have taken 10 years.
Yeah,
Um,
he was
bec-
very dedicated. He was much in seclusion during that time.
mhm.
I, Seva, Kalyani, a few others, we go see him. There was no phones, no email, no internet. The only communication with him was you had to walk up over and knock on the door. So
And,
he
and
lived.
and this was in what is now Ananda Village at Crystal Hermitage, or was this over at the retreat?
No, he'd moved to Crystal Hermitage in the fall of 71.
Okay.
But that the house, which is now Crystal Hermitage, the only thing there was the living room,
Hmm.
and it was just a freestanding dome in the middle
Hmm.
of the forest. No gardens, no chapel, nothing that you see. Just a little dome, just plopped down there, and you walk down a little trail.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so bringing that scene to mind, so how many people roughly are in the village? Are the nuns and monks established? Are they, as we set the scene, just for our listeners and for myself, really, just what's going on in the village around Swamiji while he's in seclusion and writing this? Where's he at?
it's
And
it's kind of funny because I never lived at the village. I started at the what is now the seclusion retreat. Then I moved to Ayodhya, which is the
right.
it looks different now, but is the land where Swami lived. And I moved there when there were like maybe 8 or 9 nuns, and we lived up the hill from Swami, and there were probably the same number of monks, and they lived slightly down the hill from Swami. His dome was sort of in the middle. We
Hmm.
lived in trailers. Women lived almost entirely in trailers. The men had a wider variety of shabby dwellings. I don't remember.
I think I remember because I've been a monk. I was at the monastery as a monk for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, and heard many stories from Nayaswami Prakash about,
We
this.
lived very primitively. Swami's house was much more established than the rest of ours
Hmm.
because he had different kind of work to do. He had a generator, for example, because he needed to be able to run an electric typewriter day
Hmm.
and night. But none of the rest of us. He also had indoor plumbing. By that point, he had indoor plumbing.
Wow.
We didn't have running water or indoor plumbing, but this was like I loved it. I absolutely loved living like that.
I think for us on the path now who weren't at that time, we kind of we wish we could be at that period. I think we all love to hear the stories of those early days, and I'm sure, I think you said in it in a I don't know if it was Light Bearer or other books, but that you kind of missed those days, and they were kind of golden, those first years when the work wasn't really established.
Oh no, I loved it. I mean, you were talking about how the path really helped bring you in, the new path, when Swami revised it. Um, when he was writing that, everything was really very new. He was much closer to his expulsion from SRF and much less certain about how things were going to unfold. And he felt, because the book is about his spiritual search, and then of course the much of the book is about Master.
Mm,
And one of the things that you have to have in mind is that we knew nothing about Master.
mm.
We had
Right.
Autobiography of a Yogi, and if you were part of SRF, you could hear a little bit, but we just knew nothing about Master except the few, very few books that were available.
Mm,
We had no firsthand accounts. So when Swami was writing that book, and first his own life, But then after he meets Master, which is the second half of the book, him just talking in any way about what it was like to be with Yogananda was completely new to us. He had, yes, he gave
Incredible.
satsangs and he talked sometimes, but still, it was all completely new and new to everybody in the world because no disciple had published like that. So Swami's point of view was that it was the essential first step before his service to Master uh, could even really begin. He said he needed, it was very important that he establish the link between himself and Master and make it very clear that he was acting on Master's behalf.
Wow, I've never heard it said like that. That's
Oh yeah, and he felt also, he felt that that book would build his work for Master. But he also said, but if he wrote the book and it was published and nothing happened, he'd done his part. It
yes.
wasn't like he was attached to it. He just, this is the way he felt it would happen. And if it didn't happen, as he said, well, just live quietly. And that will be just fine. What actually happened, there was a moment after he finished the book. Now, bear in mind, there's not computers. So we have the copy, and we didn't have like copy machines. So, like the copy that I had, the carbon, that's like that was the book. There was no
My
uh,
goodness.
backup. There was no cloud. There was nothing. You know. So he'd finished it. This was when it was finished, and he was saying that he anticipated that everything would really change
Hmm.
eventually after the book was done, and that the wonderful, quiet, small life that we had then would be over. So I said, "May I burn the manuscript?" And for just a moment, he looked absolutely horrified, because, and then he understood why I was saying that, but
Right.
very sympathetically. He basically
Yes.
said, no. He said, but that's when he said, but I've given it to Divine Mother and whatever she wishes.
Well, that's why I kind of chuckled when you first said that, maybe we have a quiet life. If it doesn't work, it's just like Ananda is anything but a quiet life in terms of, service and taking the mission out.
Well, we were busy, but those were the years when we basically sank our own spiritual roots. And,
Mm,
we had to, Swami was, Ananda didn't exist. And the community was, I don't know how many, but the core of the community couldn't have been more than 50 people.
mm,
There were twice as many people living there,
right.
but a great many of them were not at all in tune with what Swami was doing.
Mm,
And that's why in June of 76, so much of the community burned down,
yes.
because when all those houses burned down at the village, the people who were living in them, who didn't understand that Ananda was an ideal and thought it was a place, and the place had literally turned to ash.
Mm,
Like 50 people left, but it
yeah.
was necessary because they weren't in tune with Swami. After that, it got better. It still struggled. It struggled for a long time. But what was the point there with it? So, but he would go to San Francisco periodically, to Los Angeles periodically. We
To
did have
teach.
to teach. We
Yeah.
did have our retreat, but it was
And
all on a very low key.
and was Prakash doing like Raja Yoga? Was it Raja Yoga? Was that happening at that stage?
Prakash was teaching, but there was no internet. Bear in mind, Swami had the lessons were mail order,
Hmm.
and people would come to us, and a few of us taught a little bit off the property, but mostly Swami would go occasionally on trips.
So
But
that's amazing.
you
So
paid
so
for us,
there's
tremendous
no
respect.
path or new path. There's no other teachings, and people are just coming in from hearing about it from friends or
Yeah,
going to a
well,
class.
there was a whole scene. There was
Okay.
two
Yeah.
magazines, Yoga Journal and Yoga International. This was all print media. Basically,
Hmm.
it was the land of print media.
Yeah.
And there were communication links like those magazines. And if you were interested in the subject, you went to that magazine.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
everybody who was doing something was in there. So you could find out.
Okay.
and God, and there were metaphysical bookstores, and
Mhm.
there were ways. It just wasn't as easily accessible, and people were looking because there
Mm,
was a whole,
mm,
it was the 60s and the 70s. The whole world was turning upside down.
mm.
But still, and we were still. I mean, there was a change in the 80s, late 70s and 80s after the path was published. Swami went
Interesting.
back and forth across the country twice after it was published. He
Wow.
gave literally, several hundred lectures from coast to coast twice.
Wow.
So people came, but it was very different, and it was very wonderful because we were so isolated.
Mm.
We related to the world, but not very much.
Wow. And back when snow was hitting the ground at winter time and
The weather was much different. It was much more snow, much more
mhm,
cold. But
yeah.
you had a good pair of boots, a good down jacket, a good down sleeping bag or something equivalent, and a full rain suit.
Mm.
And you just put all that on, you're fine.
Wow.
Yeah, it
It's
was
so
wonderful.
funny when we come to the, me coming to the village in 2009 for the first time,
Hmm.
and it's so all these beautiful roads and gardens and houses and temple and expanding light. It's I could always tell that this is why I always love to talk about these early days, because I mean I remember speaking to Drew Pada, who does Vedic astrology, and he was discussing with someone else with me, just really master really sent in, and God sent in the Navy SEALs of in those early days. And I always loved that, because it really, it takes a special type of really dedicated person to 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 create that and to be part of that. I mean, it was
Well, I
just
think we had a community in the astral world. I mean, I do feel that the Navy SEALs have reincarnated again. It's just that it's you
it's the
guys and your
yeah.
techies and your global, and it was a unique time. It was a unique karmic group. I mean, the ties I have with that particular group are extraordinary
Mm,
because we did
mm,
do something together that was ours to do. I don't understand any of it, and Swamiji always did a very good job of keeping us from getting really big fat heads about it.
mhm.
Mostly, it was just a lot of fun. And
Yes.
then at a certain point, um, we had to take responsibility.
Mm,
And so we grew up. I always say to people, my childhood was at Ananda. I grew up at Ananda. And then
mm.
people try to do the math and they can't quite make that work. But I
Yes.
grew up because I learned to be a devotee, of course, but I really learned to be a person.
Mm,
I was just a raw material, and I had a few things going for me, but I just put myself into Swami's hands, and he trained me to be a person. And
yeah.
then after 10 or I was there 16 years at the village, and then he threw me down to Palo Alto where I've never left. But I was had about 10 years of real incubation,
Mm,
and then it was
yeah.
like, okay, now you can do more. And I don't, I've loved every minute of it. Every minute of it has been wonderful. There was something really special when Swami and I were talking about reincarnation, and he was talking about what brings you back to be reincarnated. He said is longing and regret, which in itself is an interesting subject. But I said, oh, Swami, I could do those first 10 years at Ananda in a heartbeat. I said, it was heaven on earth. He smiled so sweetly, said, oh, that was different. He said, that's
Wow.
in a way, a desireless desire that liberates.
Wow. Beautiful. So 77 he finishes. At what point is he asking the members of the satsangs at his home in Crystal Hermitage Dome, and he's sharing the
Right.
path as he's writing it and
Yeah.
asking for feedback
Okay,
in these satsangs?
that would have been from the beginning, 1974 to 76.
Mhm,
And he did that all the way through. And I didn't understand any of this until much later. He was all alone with this. meaning, he had no peers, he had no gurubhais. He was completely, all his gurubhais had rejected him. He was just there with us. We were good folk, but we were just a bunch of kids. We didn't know zilch from zilch. I
Mm.
mean, a few of us were a little older. Satya and Hanel were a little older, but most of us were in our 20s. Um, and he was trying to, it at that time especially, it's like all of this had to be downloaded from the astral world, meaning the whole of the spiritual path. We were eager, we had good karma, we obviously have done this many lifetimes before, but he had to, I know download is kind of a trendy word, but that's the only way I can think about it. He had to find the causal, the astral energy, and then he had to transmit it. Even when he would teach at those times, he was so intense, he would talk so fast, he would pour out ideas, not at all the way he was in the 2000s, because it was sort of like, it was like, he had to just win over this whole, he had to create this whole wave. So he's writing this book about Master. Nobody knows anything of what he's writing. He's writing about his own search for meaning, which we didn't know very, very much about.
Mhm.
And he really just, and now I know as a writer, he didn't really know if it was coming across. You're all by yourself in there with
Mhm.
your with your typewriter in that case. You have this idea, you print out these words, you think it's good, but you need another mind to hear it.
Absolutely.
And he
Absolutely.
was, and I didn't really quite understand how much he needed us to listen. He just needed to. And so we would come in, and it would be 30 or 40 people. And we'd come every Thursday night. And, whatever time, it was all through the winter. So a lot of times it was dark and rainy or snowy, and there was just gas lights. And in the winter, he had this one Pendleton plaid shirt. There's a classic picture of him in this Pendleton shirt with a clipboard, and he's editing. That was like one of
Wow.
those satsangs. He'd sit under the gas light. We'd all come in and sit on the floor around him, and he would read us a chapter or whatever. He'd read us whatever he'd done, and he would edit sometimes as he would go. And so we're just hearing it all for the very first time. And most of most people were just too awestruck. The whole situation was too beyond.
Mm.
And how many people were accomplished writers like Swami and could
Right.
keep track of what was going enough to say, this sentence over here is unclear, this concept isn't really what I know. So he would read to us, and he would ask us for feedback. And also, he was pretty intent. So if you said something like, "Sir, that paragraph didn't make any sense to me," he would say, "It was perfectly clear." And you would have to say, "No, sir, actually it wasn't, because, when I heard you say that, this is
Wow.
what I heard. Is that what you meant?" And then, you could work with him, but he wasn't a pushover. He wouldn't just like, so sometimes people were a little intimidated too.
Absolutely right.
They were sometimes just overwhelmed and had nothing to say. And sometimes even if they did, they were a little intimidated. But
Mm.
he would often try to get conversation going. I was more attuned to it, of course, because I typed the manuscripts. So
Mm.
I wasn't quite, and I was just more attuned to it. So I often would try to break the ice. And there were others in the room, Jyotish Devi, others who were more comfortable, Prakash, who was
Mhm.
an English professor of all
Of
things.
course, yeah.
So when I finally kind of got the drift, we'd try to open the conversation. And then often people would then feel more comfortable coming in. And it wasn't always corrective. Some of it was just praise. Oh, that was so interesting. And I never
Mm.
really knew that. And what did Master mean by that? And how did you feel? And later I really appreciated, and Swami made it clear that he needed to have other minds reflect back to him to
Mhm.
to keep him grounded.
Yeah.
So, in fact, at a certain point, he got really annoyed with us. He said, "You're not taking me into account." He said, "You're treating me like a Nickelodeon," is what he said, like a jukebox. You just put in your quarter and you let me perform." He said, I'm not a television. I need some interaction. You need to put out more energy." He scolded us for not putting out enough energy
Mm.
to really participate. But those were magnificent evenings. Just, I would, you didn't know what planet you were on. You, you,
It was
you walk across the hill in the snow or the rain, and you had that big window, which is still there, but it would be black night outside. There would just be nothing on the other side. And he would be in this little circle of light reading this. And I was always, I was always conscious of the spiritual magnitude of what was happening.
Hmm.
Even though the context was small, from the beginning, I always knew that we were in the presence of something really extraordinary. I never lost that. So
Very
just
special.
sitting there like that, week after week, and listening to him, watching the book unfold. Of course, my relationship to it was different because I'd come over in the afternoon and type the pages that he would read.
Mm.
Um, but
And
yeah,
and how was the so with that you were taking in that teaching as you were typing it, you were kind of tuning
oh
into
yeah,
it.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, just over and over. Again, this was many years ago now, but I knew that book pretty well, and I would
Mm.
point out, when I have turned out to be somewhat of a writer myself, and I had the inclination then. I was
Mm.
attuned to words. So I would point out when things didn't make sense because I know now from writing thousands of words myself, you think something is really clear. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I would, I or someone would say, I don't understand that. And he would just like, how can you not understand it? Or we would see a different meaning in what he wrote because he would insist couldn't possibly be interpreted from what he'd written. Just the misunderstanding of words. Even this is small, but this is very small. But he wrote once that his college roommate was an ideal roommate, quiet, reserved, supportive, tall. He said tall. I said, like, what, sir? There were a lot of shelves that you couldn't reach. I mean, you, you, you put words in like that and you don't see them. You're just
Yeah.
picturing your roommate. And he was ideal. And yeah, oh, you
Wow.
inadvertently say something silly.
Wow, what a sacred special time. It just so what a privilege to be part of
Well,
that.
he told me from, I think it was the first year I was there. I believe it when I was 24, because I moved just before I was 24, perfect astrological timing, which is why I'm sure it took me a year and a half to get there, is because it wasn't the astral moment. The astral
Mm.
moment, I arrived exactly right.
Mm.
And very early, he told me that I was going to write a biography about him. And it scared the living daylights out of me pretty much. Um, Not yet, he said, but eventually. So I was always experiencing everything. Well, even without writing a book, I always knew that I was a witness and a spokesperson for what was happening.
Mm.
That this was not an experience that I was supposed to hold in my heart and treasure and hide in my heart is what I mean by that. That it was
Yes.
I was meant to be a conduit. I found when I looked in my files to write this book, I mean, I found satsang notes from like 1973, even earlier, in which I am talking to the community about what Swami's doing. It's just like what I always did because it was
Mm.
my job and I always knew it. So
What were,
I really experienced all those things, but I also made notes about what happened and I always translated. I was just always translating.
mm, incredible. I was just the thought came to me was just is there a place where there's kind of like the notes that Swami made during this time? Is there a place, obviously there is for you. There's all this cabinets, I presume, of all the notes that you've made um, during your lifetime.
A
Did,
lot
did
of
did Swami keep those sorts of things?
well, actually, Catherine Kairavi is an archivist, and
Hmm.
a great deal of paper has been saved. There was a
Mm.
point at which he was throwing things away, and I started pulling them out of the trash.
Because
So
you knew, because
I
you
have
knew.
had, and a lot of it now has been more distributed. They're more relics than historical value, but
Mm.
pages on which he hand edited, and I still have a pile of pages that
Mm.
he hand edited. At one point, Keshava Taylor was working for Swami at that point. Also, maybe I wasn't the secretary anymore. But I remember both of us looking in the trash can and thinking, I think we should pull that out of the trash. I
Wow.
just started saving paper. A lot of the notes I took, interestingly, I took notes of the ideas that Swami spoke.
Mm.
because for many years he hadn't written all those books. A lot of the notes that I took ended up not being so important because he eventually wrote all of it himself.
Mm.
You know, in the early 70s, he hadn't written hardly any books. By the time he died, he'd written 150. So, interestingly, when I go through my notes, a lot of it is just wonderful ideas that he later articulated and sometimes better.
Wow.
Most of the best stuff that I had went into Lightbearer. When I'm
Yes.
quite surprised when I go through. There's more, but I haven't figured out yet what to do with it.
Wow.
So we'll see. And but all of his things at a certain point started being preserved, and Catherine has huge files.
Yeah.
It's relics at this point, and some of it is of historical interest. There'll be generations of people who will.
Mm. And Lightbearer is just, I
Yeah,
mean, it tunes you into, I mean, so many things, but just the incredible kind of just wave and power of Swami that seems was just this tidal wave of kind of power and outreach and attunement and everything. It was
yeah,
really incredible because you hear stories here and there and you tune into it and you know things, but it was just so put out. You know, it was very it was very special to really read that and kind of tune into Swami again in a way, in a new way, in a new deeper way. Um, uh,
his consciousness is not limited by time or space.
mm,
So his living capacity to guide and bless us is, if anything, expanded rather than diminished. And
mm,
it's not an obligation; it's an opportunity.
mm,
If you feel called to it, it's intensely personal.
yeah,
My book, like not my book, but the book that I have my name on, Lightbearer, was an attempt to just do the. I mean, I wrote. It's not the new path, but I tried to do. I tried to give people the story, and that's why it ended up year by year of the 40 plus years that I was there. I wrote it year by year,
mm,
everything that happened, and not everything by any means, but much of what happened
right,
and the trajectory of that experience.
mm,
And I feel like I think I have more to do, but uh, I tried as much as I could, and he guided me. I wrote it after he died, but he he dictated it to me, and when I
mm,
wasn't following his dictation, I didn't
yeah,
get to write it the way I wanted to. It had to go the
yeah,
way he did. And that's how Swami said about when he was writing the path.
mhm,
It was like he had one idea about how it was going to go. One of the stories I told, I think it's in Swami Kriyananda as we have known him, when Swami started in again in 1974, he had all these little pieces of paper because he'd been taking notes too for years and making notes and notes when Master was living and then afterwards. And I came in and he had it spread out all over the floor. You know, Swami was much younger then. He was on the floor, crawling around on the floor. He wasn't an old man. He was on the floor. He had all these piles of notes. He'd spent the whole day organizing it. This was when he started. And sitting on the floor, I remember he didn't get up. He just looked up at me and just in this like um, sort of white faced, how am I ever going to turn this into a book about Master? And
wow,
he just
incredible,
and he said many times he was very scared. Is he was intimidated by the magnitude of what he was undertaking because
mm,
nobody had ever written it. I mean, nobody has even to this day except a journalist. But well, Durgamata wrote a book, but there's no books about Master by disciples, and none had been written at that point. And all the people who were close to Master thought Swami was a renegade. And there he was. He was going to write the first bhakti biography of Master, and he was scared. He said he was scared. He knew that the magnitude of the responsibility was enormous. So he dived in, and there were days when he was well. It took him over. I mean, what happened to him on a much higher level is what happened to me, which I can speak now from experience. At the time, I just watched him. I was much younger. I had no experience. I just watched him. 40 years later, when I'm by myself trying to write about him, I recognize in my experience what he said about his.
Mm,
And I see then what was, Master just told him what to say. And he, I
yes.
mean, he talked about it's like certain things he could get them into the book and certain things he couldn't get into the book
Uh,
because
I,
Master had it planned.
yeah. Can I actually read from Swami Kriyananda as we have known him?
Sure.
This which is this. I mean, my favorite book. I think. I mean, at the moment, it's Whispers from Eternity, as you well know. But the New Path has definitely had my heart. But this book, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him, when I was living at the village, and in fact living in Leela's apartment in the Crystal Hermitage, I was really tuning into Swami through this book. It's so powerful, and this story struck me because also around that time I'd been told, I think we had been told, I was serving in the Sangha at Ananda village, that Swami had wanted to have a department for each book. And maybe it was after he passed because, it was in his
No, he
last
had
will. And
that idea. He had that idea many years before. It
so
was
maybe, I mean, I came to the village in 2012. So it's 2013, 14, something like that. I heard that. And I always felt if I was ever to be involved in something like that, it would be the New Path at that
uh-huh,
time.
very
And
good.
then reading this text because it touched my heart so much.
Mhm.
But reading this story is really, along with my heart is connected to the New Path. But this story is how I'm really started. Why I wanted to do the book study and also do it in a way where we're taking some time to meditate. I mean, I have no clue how it's going to go
Mhm.
or anything. It would be interesting if you had any thoughts, but this one story really um, spoke to me of how deeply powerful and was instructive in kind of choosing to do it this way. And because the other thing is when you read the New Path, I mean, there's some pages where it's just golden nugget of wisdom after golden nugget of wisdom after golden nugget of wisdom, and you have to, you're so enthused to read on, but really you have it demands that you take time and really go into it. And because it's such a big book, I think your book is bigger though. The Light Bearer is a little bit longer.
Yes,
We got
yes,
we got
yes.
autobiography, then we got the New Path, and then we got Light Bearer. But
Uh-huh,
I have no clue how long we'll be doing this weekly satsang.
uh-huh.
But anyway, I'll read this. But I really felt that you have to take time with the New Path to. I mean, I guess it's true for all of his work. But
Mm,
so it's on page 232. It's meditate on greatness, and Swami says, writing this book, The Path, should have taken me 10 years, but I worked on it with great intensity and finished it in 3. Swamiji said, of course, that doesn't count all the years I spent collecting the stories and meditating on them. I didn't dare write a single episode of Master's life until I had meditated on it and was sure I had understood, as far as I was able, what it meant. Sometimes it took years. In order to explain them to others, I had to go deeply into every facet. It was a growing experience for me. No one could learn as much from this book as I have myself. Then I had to decide how many of those levels of meaning I would explain and how much I would leave to the reader to meditate on and grow in the experience as I have. Meditating on greatness is a way of achieving greatness
That's
oneself.
lovely. Yeah, that's marvelous. All his words, those were wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. Yeah. There's a lot of, you have to have a lot of, let's see, not everything can be articulated in words. And
Mhm.
Swami's writing is exceedingly subtle in the sense that it seems to be very simple and clear, but the way I think about it always is that he walks you across the top of the mountain
Mhm.
and you from the top of the mountain you can actually look down all the way into the valley and see how you got there, but he doesn't necessarily include all the scenery from the bottom up. You start at the top of the mountain and then you have to meditate And how did I get here? How did he
Mm.
get here? How can I get here? Yeah, it's wonderful. Meditating on greatness brings you greatness. I mean, the book to Swamiji is a book about Master. The fact
Yes.
that his autobiography is incidental, it's Master's greatness he wanted to put across.
And that was the thing, as you've already said, it was just, it really showed you, still to me in a way, the deepest way of that experience of disciple, guru, and the path and the pitfalls, which is very, you know, I mean, just like you have the chapter, the two that are very helpful I've always found is a divine test on the one hand, which has one of my favorite line, at least my most quoted line when I'm sharing in satsangs, is if the spiritual path is not so difficult if you take it but one step at a time. and
Fabulous.
and
Yeah.
it's just so I always go to a divine test. And then the other one is, I mean, is attunement, just, informing you really the message, many messages, but just negativity and positivity, the power of kind of tuning in to how to stay in tune. Being negative brings you out of attunement. And there's many other messages within that chapter, but there's just so much richness on the path throughout.
Right.
um
That particular chapter, attunement, see, what would happen would be describing the somewhat isolated situation. Swamiji would be very alone all day. I mean, not just physically alone, but mentally undisturbed. There was just nothing. None of us worked near him. We all went across to the farm, to the village to work. So we would all vacate, all the monks, all the nuns would vacate, and he would really be alone in a wonderfully psychically quiet space. And then usually at 4 in the afternoon, I and a few others would come back to the house and help with the typing and so on, whatever. But the day he wrote Attunement, he essentially was telling us that something had happened to him that day, that this chapter had just poured through him, and
Interesting.
that it was, and he was extremely elevated in his consciousness and very separated from any responsibility for what had been written. That
Mm.
it had just been given to him, and he had poured it out as best he could. And it is, I agree with you, it's an extraordinary chapter. And the subject of attunement is so subtle
Mm.
that what he manages to put across in that chapter is, I like you, I've gone back to it many, many times. And just, there's so much power in it to tell us things that are very hard to know, that we have to learn. Somehow we have to learn them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's still not, I'm still learning it myself. I mean, my goodness.
Well,
I mean, I just tuning into this, I've had a period just in this last week or so where I was just really fighting mental positivity, mental negativity, and just thinking about it here, it just begs, to really tune into, how can I tune into the positive? How can I get back in tune? And I think it's going to be until you get there, probably, that you're kind of really working on that attunement. But
at the very end of his life, I mean, in the last years of his life,
mm,
Swamiji would essentially say, "Oh, if I could only be with Master now. If I
yeah.
could be with him now, I was so young. If I could be with him now, knowing what I know." I mean, in an attempt to be positive, said, "Sir, but wouldn't that always be true? Wouldn't it always be true that if I could only, I mean, what that means simply is that the path has worked, that
Right.
I'm not where I was when I started, but if I could be in the company of Master as I am now, back then." And I
Yes.
mean, he understood that's exactly the truth. Of course, you're always learning, but the path worked for him.
Mm,
he he was given a very, very challenging commission from Master when he was a young monk, and
mm,
at a certain point in his life, um, soon after he wrote the Gita, really, I would say would be the point, which was about 2006, because that one really oppressed him until he got that done. It was a little more than 2006, but once he got the Gita done, he really exhaled. And
Wow.
it was like, and well, he was back in India by then, which was
Mhm,
also important.
mhm.
He was back in India. And then when he wrote the Gita, it was, well, I did it. And his demeanor started changing earlier than that, but it really shifted after he wrote the Gita because now he could go. And he
Right.
almost did leave the body multiple times, but the last thing that was left was the Nayaswami order.
Mm.
So
And
when he did it, yeah.
it was very interesting because I remember I came to the village for the first time in 2009, and then in
Mm,
2000 I did meditation teacher training and took Kriya at that visit, and then in 2010 I came back for the summer for 3 weeks to do meditation teacher training too, and stayed I think for the first day of just the talk of spiritual renewal week, and in fact that day I came across you on your own at the table in the plaza of the Expanding Light, and we had a little connection. And I can't remember what we said at all, but I remember it being very inspiring energetically and vibrationally.
good.
But what I do remember from that time is Swami. I remember listening to a talk. I think it must have been that day when I was thinking back to this, but Swami was not doing well, and his memory was like he couldn't quite grasp his thoughts when he was talking in the amphitheater, uh, and but all of a sudden at some point he goes to his story of sharing about um, I think it was masters, at the garden party, and use must go north, south, east, west, and it was like a sunny day in this amphitheater, and it was like the whole world stood up and paid attention
Mm,
with this power that just came through him
wow.
as he in that moment was clear, powerful master, and it was just incredible to witness that.
That was the time when he was really letting go of this world a lot,
Mm,
those
mm,
last couple of years. And that was a transition where he was really just the only time he would get really focused was when he was talking around master. The rest of the time he had a hard time focusing on this world. That's right.
yeah,
It was a very interesting time. Yeah. But whenever you talk about master, you get very, very, and that would
yeah.
be pretty much whatever he was supposed to talk about, he would bring it to that.
And what very much struck me as well, just uh, was literally when he would come into the amphitheater, and just the silence and the mutual love of him sharing his vibration and friendship and love and consciousness as he entered, but also, and this really helped me decide to move to the village, was just this deep love and respect back from all of the members. It was so tangible. It just made you have a sense of respect, but also just I'd never experienced anything like it before, and there's just so much power in some of those little moments that you don't necessarily you hear the teachings and things like this, and all the books and the music, but it's some of those moments that are so informative inwardly. um,
Absolutely. Sanjan, that's beautifully articulated. And because my life experience was so different and will never be replicated,
mm,
and I perceived everything from a different angle,
mm,
that's a really, that was a really clear and definite expression of what actually happened. And
mm,
I never saw it because I was on a different side of it. Thank you
Mm.
for that. I really appreciate hearing that.
And because also the other thing was my mum a few years later then in 2012 came to visit from England, and she knew I'd come to this path, but she didn't know a lot about it. But she was on a spiritual path herself. um, and for those that don't know, whenever Swami would come to the village, people would meet him at the entrance, and or would meet would when he would go, they would converge at the entrance exit and kind of wave him goodbye. And there was this deeply tangible experience, and my mum you know experienced that, and she didn't know this path, but she had tears in her eyes because she could just feel this
Mhm, mhm,
this amazing
mm,
experience. And
mm,
what I was always astounded by was just that she said he's so wise, and
mm,
yet I think she only really heard him speak once, and I don't know that she grasped everything
mm,
because it was talking about the path deeply, but she understood
mm,
the vibration
mm.
of love. And yeah, it was
It's
just so
wonderful.
yeah,
Well, that's exactly what drew me to Swami in 15 seconds. He has what I want. I couldn't have
exactly.
even said what it was, but I could feel that it was. Mm.
Yeah,
So your mom felt it too. Wonderful.
yeah. So we're drawing to the end now. In fact, we're just a couple moments over. Any just last thoughts of, so we're tomorrow at 8:15, I begin the book study. We're going to listen to Swami on the Ananda Sacramento YouTube channel, him reading some of the new path. So you don't have to read the path before, but I encourage it. We're going to start at chapter 15, a map discovered. And we will look back at some of the other bits, and maybe at the end we'll go all the way back.
Mhm.
But you have taught many classes on his books. Any advice, and just hearing what was said that you had written from Swami in Swami Kriyananda as we have known him, any last thoughts of how to dive into this text, or how to really bring out of it?
I think that spiritual growth, just as you yourself said a few moments ago, it's it's a series of what seem to be unconnected moments,
Mm,
but I think they're connected by a divine thread. So when you pick up a book as massive as The New Path with so many potentials, I don't think one has to worry about being comprehensive. All that
mm,
you have to do is pay attention in the moment and see what you're going to learn in that moment that day from those words.
mm.
And if one just settles down and enjoys what's right in front of you, then I think it'll tell you what you want to know. And
Yes.
and the experience of just doing that, I mean, it's almost like opening at random, but that sort of thing.
Mm.
Um, Divine Mother talks to us a lot, and it's just a question of how often we listen. So I think that that's what I would say.
So true, right? Absolutely. Well, Usher, it's been an absolute joy. I could talk for another hour or two, but I'm very grateful. I know that everyone else will be too. So thank you for your time, and look forward to joining you in your satsangs online. And for those that want to, you can join me tomorrow live on Ananda Sacramento YouTube, 8:15 to 8:55, and we'll see where it goes. Who knows how it's going to happen? I don't have a clue, but I've got a couple ideas for the first class, but I don't know beyond that really.
Well, I think it'll
Yeah,
be a wonderful experience. I'm very happy that you're doing it.
yeah. Well, bless you.
Appreciate
Thank you so much, and thank you
it.
everyone for watching.
God
God
bless.
bless.